Hello, I'm Randy Flood, psychologist, and I'm here with my colleague Zach Flood, who's also a psychologist working with me at Fountain Hill Center for Counseling and Consultation Center. We are here to talk today about when instinct isn't enough, navigating parental alienation for parents and clinicians. We are grateful for Family Access and Elaine Cobb for having us, and we look forward to spending some time with you today. So, just as an overview of what we want to talk about today, is that we wanted to speak to both parents and professionals. So, we welcome mental health and legal professionals who might be listening to this, and we also are speaking to parents. And secondly, we want to introduce this concept or this spectrum of estrangement versus alienation. Because I think if you're in the throes of alienation or you're in the throes of estrangement, you don't realize that you're on one side of the continuum and that there's another side to this. And so we want to introduce you to that spectrum so that you can appreciate the conundrums and complexities that counselors and evaluators get into when they are looking at that continuum or they're not aware of the other side. So we want to bring you into the therapy office or the counselor's office and help you see how these cases can be complex to them. And then we want to discuss important concepts that we think therapists, evaluators, professionals, and you as parents want to be tracking if you're specifically in an alienation case, which this presentation ultimately is about, is focusing on alienation. And then finally, we will spend some time reviewing best practices and interventions that we find that are workable in alienation cases specifically. We like to talk about clinical intuition because, again, that is something that's developed over time with education, with training, and after years of experience and practice. Um, my intimate partner worked in the OB field, and she talked about doctors who would come in and have clinical intuition, and would walk into a patient's room and say she's ready to deliver. And when she was a young nurse, she would say, like, "How do you know that?" He goes, "I can just tell." He goes, "Aren't you going to look at the strip to make sure?" He goes, "Go ahead, show it to me." And then oftentimes they would chuckle and say he or she was right. So clinical intuition is something you develop over time, and it's just something that's stored in your brain and your belly brain of kind of what your gut is telling you about what is happening in a particular situation. All professional clinicians typically are adequately trained and educated in child abuse, neglect, and intimate partner violence. And again, recently, when I first started in the field in the 1990s, there wasn't a lot of really good training on domestic violence. There was on child abuse and neglect, but again, we've done a pretty good job in graduate schools and in continuing education to train clinicians on estrangement and intimate partner violence. But most professional clinicians are not educated and trained on high conflict divorce dynamics. And again, that's a special area to understand how children and co parents function in high conflict divorce, and particularly in the first 2 years post separation. There's this phrase that attorneys use called divorce psychoses, which means that people kind of lose their grounding and lose their best selves for a couple years sometimes in high conflict divorces because it's such an emotionally powerful experience. And then they get their groundings and their feet back on the ground again. But yeah, a lot of people don't understand perhaps some of those dynamics and not have specific training. And there's a paucity of professional clinicians who are educated and trained on parental alienation dynamics. And so, what becomes intuitive is oftentimes what you go with. And so, we find that estrangement dynamics are intuitive and parental alienation dynamics are counterintuitive. So while clinicians do the math on the families, they oftentimes don't realize that trigonometry is what's needed to really figure out what's going on in the family dynamics when parental alienation is involved. So if you look at the screen now, you will see a picture, and some of you might have seen this. And this is a way that I think that we can sometimes um, understand our kind of our anchor bias and kind of what we're used to seeing. Some of you might look at that picture and see an older lady. Um, and again, I'm just going to let you study it for a little bit. And then if you see the older lady, you might then take a look at the image differently, and you're going to see a younger lady, a younger woman in the image. And you can toggle back and forth between the two, but some can only see just one and not the other. And that's what we understand happens oftentimes in counseling offices, is that people don't appreciate the other image, and they don't have training in it. And so we want to spend time helping you appreciate that today.
All right. Thanks, Randy. And really quick before I continue, I just wanted to also thank Elaine for the time today. And it's just really awesome to be here and be able to talk about this and don't take that for granted. So thank you, Elaine. Finally, or furthermore, I just want to talk about the context of high conflict divorces. So Randy was mentioning earlier where these type of dynamics can play out, and most of the time, and a vast majority of the time, these are going to happen within a high conflict divorce environment. So it's important for us to try to define what that looks like, so we can get a sense of what that actually means and when maybe that label is misapplied. So we want to look at what that means for high conflict, and so we define that as parents that are unable and unwilling to work together. There's two different variables there. Unable to, which can be a lack of continuity there, a lack of ability to find the ability to communicate with each other, and then an unwillingness, which can be like a stubbornness or a resistance to be able to go across the aisle there to be able to talk to the other party. They're frequently in court is another way to define high conflict divorce. There's an unwillingness to work together, so therefore a lot of those disagreements have to be uh, decided or furthered by the court or by some mediator or referee, because that's the only way that any type of consensus can be reached. And a lot of times these cases, these people have high motive, and they also have a lot of means to make it possible, because a lot of divorce proceedings can be very expensive. A lot of lawyers involved, and a lot of different dynamics and parties that can be a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So we'd like to define those high conflict divorces as those systems where both parents are contributing to these dynamics, and both everyone's kind of bringing everybody to court. Um, where it doesn't apply, and there's can be like a broad umbrella, is some divorces can be categorized as high conflict when there's really a false equivalent. So there could be a situation where there's one parent that's bringing the other parent to court all the time. There's one parent that's especially resistant to any type of conciliation or any type of progress or growth or compromise. And then the other parent is, that parent's being attacked. There's a targeted parent in that regard. There's a lot of allegations being thrown at by this really resistant parent, or this really high conflict parent. And that parent who's being targeted is just trying to defend themselves and trying to stand their ground on what they feel is right. And they're playing a lot of defense. And all of a sudden, this can be seen as a high conflict divorce under this big umbrella, but it's one parent that's really trying to make this all happen, or really trying to bring all these issues to court. So we want to try to get an understanding of what high conflict is when there's both parties involved and there's a lot of different cooks in the kitchen, versus when there's a miscategorization there and there's actually just one parent that's contributing most of this. It's important, I think, for us to be able to understand a little bit of the broader context of how we got here in our culture today, and try to have a sense of what the change what change has gone down in the culture of divorce. So in the very early stages of our modern society here, the divorce process was much more gendered, and parenting plans flowed from rigid gender roles. So there was a tender years statute, which is basically grounded in the patriarchy of a mother being at home, and being more of the caretaker, and the father being the breadwinner. And so in those early years of the child, um, the mother would be the person staying at home and have more of that parental custody and that physical custody. There was the advent of the gender role revolution. Both parents started having more access to money and influence, and this created an environment prime for litigation, because the assumption then at the beginning was 50-50. And so once that evolution started, then there was a little more of a primed environment for this back and forth, and trying to go to court, try to figure out best foot forward, rather than just assuming the tender year statutes taking precedent there. Um, there's the presumption of shared custody um, uh, means that to limit one parent's access to the children requires a lot of finagling by the court, a lot of motions, a lot of these things. So that again brings families to court more and more, and that's just important for us to understand how that's different than it was in the past. And then also just broadly, our society is more polarized and divisive. We see that today. A lot of the language that's being used has infiltrated its way into the court. A lot of the bombastic language and the way that these families interact with each other has followed the trend in greater society. And so it's just important to understand that divorce in 2024 is much different than the divorce would have been in, say 1972. So, um, okay, so Randy touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to talk a little bit more broadly about the spectrum of parent-child contact problems. And so he mentioned earlier a lot of the training around estrangement, and I could just say in my graduate school, I had one full class on trauma. I just the whole semester where I had 3 credit class just on trauma, how to treat it, how to identify it. And that was very much through an estrangement dynamic of being able to help kids with sexual, physical abuse, and neglect, all these things. And so it was very much emphasized, and for good reason. There's a lot of different cases where that's really important. But it's important to think about the spectrum of what's called parent-child contact problems. And what those are, the PCCPs, are the behaviors manifesting in the child where they are resisting a parent. And so those can happen for a lot of different reasons. We'll get into more details about those later, but it's important to understand that there is a spectrum there that these can manifest from. So to differentiate the two, we want to go to the next slide here and talk and try to define these things for you more clearly. The first one is parent-child estrangement occurs when a parent is either neglectful or abusive to children. This maltreatment over time can cultivate negative emotions in child and attachment problems, resulting in parent-child estrangement. And then on the alienation side, we define that parental alienation originates from variables predominantly outside the experiential parent-child relationship. It is spurious and deceptive presentation. Typically, the children are systematically and unduly rejecting one parent in order to remain attached and loyal to an alienating parent. And so you can see that there's a different way that those are going to manifest. And we'll get into more details about that later. But it's important to understand that a child resisting contact with a parent or having resistance or refusal of time can manifest in a couple different ways. And it's important for us in the context of this presentation to talk about more of the alienation side, because the estrangement really is covered in a lot of the training that is presented to therapists. And it's important for parents to know, targeted parents, to understand this dynamic as well, because when you're going into a clinician's office, it's possible that they have more of an understanding of an estrangement dynamic. So they're going to, again, like as Randy was talking about, use that intuition. So it's important to be able to develop empathy for that clinician, to be able to understand how you, as a targeted parent, are going to navigate that dynamic. So it's really important for us to be able to define those things. And so, again, just to this further context here on what we would define as estrangement neglect cases. We obviously talk about child abuse. There's sexual abuse and physical abuse. Those are pretty straightforward in terms of the training and the narrative and the information around there around out there that clinicians have access to. There's child neglect, where children are left alone and not really cared for. There's domestic violence, like Randy mentioned earlier, intimate partner violence, where there's abuse of both the children and the other intimate partner. And also just general parental unfitness, which some of those can be just mental health diagnoses where there's no fault of anybody, but it's important to understand how those can get in the way of a parent's ability to be an effective parent if they have disorganized thought or if they have any of the other acting out behaviors. There would be substance abuse. We see that a lot in estrangement neglect cases, where an addiction will get in the way of a parent's ability to be present for the child. There's sexual acting out and just general poor parenting that rises to the level of abuse and neglect. Those things can cause these families to have resist and refuse dynamics. But it's important to look at those in the broader context of what we're talking about here today.
All right, thanks, Zach. So the next side we're going to discuss is from the Kelly Johnson 2001 article, I think it was, that was put out in the Family Court Review. So this is a continuum, and it helps us understand what is considered fairly normative with children in, again, divorce situations. Um, so the one side of the continuum, you'll see that there's a positive relationship with both parents, and of course that's idyllic. That we would want children to have connections. There are very different types of attachments and connections, but albeit both positive. And then one other along that continuum is a child developing an affinity toward one parent over another. And again, an affinity is just a general liking toward that parent, and that can emanate from it's same gender perhaps, and they have similar interests. That could be just a personality thing. The interests and hobbies that you have are similar to the child, and so that a child just enjoys spending time with that parent. But it doesn't mean that they dislike the other parent. There's just a general liking. And then the other further along that continuum is when a parent, or excuse me, a child develops an alliance toward a parent, and it shows a strong preference toward a parent. Again, it doesn't mean that they're rejecting the other parent. There's just a strong liking preference that we would categorize as an alliance. And usually you don't see resist or refuse dynamics in the positive affinity and alliance. You see children going back and forth following custody orders, but you just notice that in your office as a clinician, those alliances or affinities. Now, moving into what is not what we often see on that spectrum is when you have estranged and alienated children, and that is been described earlier by both of us. So let's talk about this concept called gatekeeping, because again, when you get a custody and parenting time order in place post judgment of divorce, there is going to be some kind of process called gatekeeping, where the custodial parent is responsible to open and shut the gate as appropriate, and letting the child move out of their custody and into the custody of the other parent, and that's the notion of gatekeeping. And so there's three different types of gatekeeping that we want to introduce you to. The first one is facilitative or positive, which refers to situations in which the parent encourages, supports, and facilitates contact with the other, with the child and the parent. And again, with positive affinity alliances, that can be a facilitative process, and the children go back and forth with no resist or refuse dynamics in the case. And then the second gatekeeping type is restrictive or negative, and this refers to situations in which the parent discourages, interferes with, or prevents contact with with the child. And again, that is negative and restrictive because an objective point of view would be that the children should be going back and forth, and this restrictive should not be happening. And so that's usually an alienation dynamic when we deem it to be restrictive and negative. Now, protective is refers to situations in which the parent, in an attempt to protect the child, prevents the other parent contact with the child. And so this is more in estrangement cases where we would say someone is being protective and doing the right thing by keeping the gate closed. Alienating parents often will claim that they're being protective when in fact they are, per an assessment, they're assessed as being restrictive and negative. So they'll present as protective. So when we walk into a therapist's office, I think it's important now, as you've had this kind of spectrum defined for you, to see that alienation and estrangement dynamics can present very similarly to an untrained eye. So what to do is take you inside a therapist's office and in their assessment skills, and get you a sense of what is happening. And so you're aware that when you walk into a therapist's office, you are very clear. Say, I'm an alienating parent, or my children are alienating children. And so I'm going to walk into a therapist's office, and then the therapist is going to know that, and then they're going to help me. And what we want to do is show you that it's not that simple, and that it can present in really complicated puzzle that a trained clinician needs to kind of put together. And some of them, again, know how to do the math, but they don't know how to do the trigonometry. So, from a targeted parent's behavior, let's just say you're a targeted parent of parental alienation and you are going to walk into a therapist's office, and they're going to be assessing whether you are a parent who is being rejected for good reason, meaning that the other parent is being protective, or are you a parent who's experiencing obstructive, negative gatekeeping? And so you present with obfuscation, like denial, minimization, and blame. So the other parent came in, set the table for the clinician, and said that you are a terrible, abusive parent and all these things. And so what we do know in estrangement, abusers tend to obfuscate, tend to deny their abuse, tend to minimize it, and say, "Oh, I always hit the kid a couple times." Most parents lose their mind with stressful situations, and so and then plus they blame the other parent and say, if you understood my partner, you would understand why I was getting so upset and so stressed out. And so if you are a targeted parent, you're going to go into the office and you're going to try to deconstruct the narrative that was set up for you, and that clinician could assume that you're minimizing, you're blaming, and you're not taking responsibility for what you did do if they're looking at it through an estrangement lens. Another one is like threatening or actively pursuing custody, or claiming a former partner is unfit and destroying the victim financially. Again, these are all things we know that abusive and controlling people do in estrangement. But if you're a targeted parent, you're not trying to threaten custody, you're just trying to gain access. And you're saying, if I can't work with this parent, then maybe I need to be the custodial parent because I will be a facilitative gatekeeper. I'm not going to keep them from. So again, you could present as though you're threatening custody. If you're trying to say that, look, I'm not unfit. I've had a good base rate relationship with my children. We did lots of things together. It's the other parent that's had issues with the kids. It's not me. And you need to understand that alienation is abusive. And again, you're making the other parent seem unfit. And again, the clinician could look at that through an estrangement lens. And then destroying the victim financially. Zach said earlier, in high conflict, sometimes it's not a high conflict case. You're playing defense as an alienated parent, and you're trying to go to the judge and you're petitioning to try to get access, and you're accused of destroying that person financially. And that's what abusers will do. They'll use financial abuse to destroy that person so that a clinician can assume that you are destroying that parent financially as well. So again, going through these estrangement dynamics that coach pressure and brainwash the children, using CPS, friend of the court, bad mouthing and controlling the former partner, using exchanges to harass and intimidate, and then illegal harassment and control. These are things that abusive and controlling parents do. And if you're a targeted parent, you are not trying to brainwash the children, you are trying to unbrainwash the children. So when they're coming to your house and saying you're a horrible parent and you're trying to counter that narrative, that's not pressuring them, that's trying to get the children back to reality. When you're trying to talk to the friend of the court and you're going to CPS for the fifth time with another allegation that you're abusive, you're not using CPS, but you're involved in CPS. And so then the clinician can think that, oh, CPS is involved. It must be an estrangement case. But no, they're all being unsubstantiated. And again, all these efforts to try to gain access to your children in alienation can be seen as harassment, when in fact you're just trying to be a loving parent. So it can be misconstrued.
All right, so we just talked about the behaviors of the targeted parent that can be misconstrued as, for to an untrained eye, as an abusive parent and a controlling parent. We also want to talk about the child's behavior within the context of either their family life or their presentation in in a clinician's office. So you could just say at a surface level, internalizing disorders of depression and anxiety, insecure attachment style manifesting as dismissal of the targeted parent, externalizing disorders such as oppositionality, aggressiveness, school truancy, substance abuse, and then even self-harm behaviors, just thoughts about suicide, all these things. if you have an untrained eye, like I mentioned, or like we mentioned before, where they have a predisposition towards looking at estrangement or abuse, like all that narrative that could be put forth by an alienating parent can present all these things as an abuse dynamic or an estrangement dynamic. And the tricky thing is a lot of these things can manifest from alienation as well. So if you're going and saying that like, hey, this child is depressed and anxious because they're being alienated, they're rejecting me even though they really love me, they're having all these behaviors such as self-harm behaviors, all of this is then you can put forth that as alienation. But if you're doing it too aggressively, that can again come across as what Randy was saying earlier about minimization or blaming or deflection and all these things. And so we have to be able to understand how these things can manifest from both sides of that spectrum that we presented earlier so that you can put your best foot forward with empathy and trying to look at the big picture and understand the broader dynamics and what the clinician might be looking at. And so again, all these things on this list that I just mentioned can come from both. And so it's important to know that. Furthering on that list there, the separation anxiety from the favored parent, refusal and resistance of court-ordered parenting time, contact refusal with rejected parents, extended family. These are all things that can happen in both estrangement and alienation cases, just in a vacuum. And so you have to be able to understand the ways that that can be misconstrued by an untrained eye, and being able to present your case cogently and clearly to say, here are the things that are going on, but I understand it might look like this. I just want to give you my perspective, and then just the best foot forward there to present yourself as put together, rather than blaming and minimizing the other party. And it's just important to understand that while it feels so true to you as an alienated parent, it feels so clear in your head, you know what's going on, you've been living your life and doing this for so long that you just feel like it should be so straightforward. But again, we're trying to set the stage for you as an alienated parent that going into these clinicians' office, they might see these things and just have a quick judgment um, towards what this might look like. And then for also, as we speak to clinicians in this scenario, if you're watching this as a clinician, it's really important to understand that these things can come into your office, and it might not be as simple. We're going to go into a little bit of that later. It might not be as simple as what it just presents as in the room or what's being told to you, and it's just okay to be curious and try to understand the different layers of this, especially within a divorce context such as this. And furthermore, just one more slide here, just to add to that list, an affectionately close and strong attachment to the favored parent. The child is frustrated or angry with the targeted parent. The older siblings always wanting to look after the younger siblings. These are things again that can manifest in both scenarios, and so it's important to understand that you have to be able to present these factors clearly, and try to communicate your perspective while being able to empathize and understand the broader context in which this stuff could play out. As you go into that, again, going back into this situation of walking into a therapist's office, trying to get the help that you need, trying to present your narrative, your perspective in a way that the clinician can hear you rather than feeling like you're trying to avoid any type of accountability or any type of role in this thing. So it's just really important to understand the broad big picture there. So the big thing that plays into this is what's called the fundamental attribution error. And what we want to look at here is this is the fuel, this is the engine for some of that misinterpretation that we just outlined in the last few slides. In the fundamental attribution error, we are trained as clinicians to help children advocate for themselves and communicate their needs. The big thing that's important in a lot of cases, being able to have a child have the vocabulary, being able to properly communicate their needs and their feelings. The tricky part is uh, that in an alienation dynamic that can get twisted, and all of a sudden the child isn't speaking for themselves and they're furthering a narrative that isn't isn't innate to them, isn't natural to them. So the abuse of the hands of the targeted parent that is reported by the child can be taken at face value. That's the attribution. I'm attributing all these things that were mentioned in this previous list. I have to attribute that to an abusive parent because that makes sense to me. And so the acting out behavior is attributed to the alleged abuse rather than the true cause, the alienation dynamic. And that's the fundamental attribution error. I'm attributing it to an estrangement rather than alienation dynamic. And that's what we're trying to broaden the perspective for these clinicians that might be watching this, and for the targeted parents that might be watching this, that it's important to understand that you have to be able to push against that narrative in a respectful and clear way. um, the stakes of this can be pretty high. So if this fundamental attribution error is furthered and these things are assumed to be things that they are not, they are assumed to be abuse dynamics, then that can lead to the misapplication of traditional therapeutic interventions. Because all of a sudden you've got all this training on trauma-informed interventions and all these ways to help kids navigate abuse and heal from abuse, is then you're applying these interventions to kids that aren't actually being abused, and then that furthers the dynamic of like of trying to help this child try to believe this narrative that they're being fed, and all of a sudden that makes it worse, and there's more guilt and there's more shame piled on top. And all of a sudden, this clinician that's really trying to do the best that they can, they're trying to help a child that they believe is being abused, and all of a sudden they're making it worse. And so the anxiety or other acting out behaviors are validated and treated this lens of estrangement. The child just goes deeper into delusion. And that just furthers the emotional abuse of the child. It's really important to understand that. So as a clinician, you have to be able to see both sides of this and be able to try to treat properly. Otherwise, you're doing more harm than good. And that's obviously no one's goal as a clinician. And so that's why we have to try to train and be more aware of these dynamics.
Yeah, and it's I just wanna reiterate what Zach said too, is that, you know, we have compassion and understanding for clinicians who make these missteps, and we want to try to, help, people. We wanna be able to explain how it happens, because I think sometimes we think that, clinicians are just waking up, to go into work and deciding they would want to be malicious and create more problems for children, and that's exactly why they got into the business. It's it's to make people miserable. Probably not. They got into the business because they wanna help, and so they think they're helping, and in fact, they're not. And you see that happening clinically in other situations. Someone comes in with an addiction, and they're not talking about the addiction, and they're talking about their depression. And so you're working on their depression, and focusing on that and not addressing the substance abuse, which is most likely contributing to it, or not going to, you're not going to get any traction unless you confront the substance abuse. And so they're unwittingly making the patient worse, not knowing that it's a substance abuse disorder that's causing it. All right, so let's look at how allegations are utilized in alienation cases. And again, if we remember the previous slides about estrangement, and Zach went through, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, domestic violence, all of that. If you're going to be an effective alienator, then one of the things that you do is that you make allegations that are a form of weaponization, and because again, trained clinicians have this attuned ear and to attuned vision for estrangement. And so if you throw out allegations of domestic violence or child abuse, they're gonna, it's kind of like red meat for a clinician. They go right after it. And so let's look at some of these allegations. The first category that we want to talk about is called a miscategorized allegation. So an allegation is that the parent is too rigid, it's too authoritarian, and that's what the problem is. And so if the clinician believes that that's true, then that's a miscategorization. If objectively what we have parental differences. And again, in wherever you are watching this in your state or whatever country you're in, if you look at what is the bell curve of what normative, diverse parenting strategies and styles, we know that there's a huge variety. The person that parents next door to you has a later curfew, or they have differences of how much they let their children watch screen time, or how much independence they have of whether they go to the ice cream store or not. There's so much diversity that's normative, and what happens is that these normative differences get miscategorized, and someone is wrongly accused of being too lenient or wrongly accused of being too restrictive, when it's just part of the diversity of parenting. And so the second category of allegations is what we call decontextualize, and this occurs when the targeted parent's responses or adaptive actions are not contextualized to the alienating parent's co-parenting actions, and then they're erroneously assessed in isolation without appropriate contextual history or situational awareness. And that's a mouthful, but you all know that what we're talking about here if you're an alienating parent. Because, for example, the children come over to your house and they struggle during the transition, leaving the alienating parent. They're a little isolative and a little mean and disruptive, but then after a couple hours or so, they transition, they start going out in the living room and start interacting. You guys play a game of chess or whatever, and the kids come to life and everything's great and you're having normative interactions with your children. Then all of a sudden they get on their iPad and they start connecting with the alienating parent. And then you notice their digression into again isolating in the rooms, being really mean and oppositional and rude. And so you come up with this, pretty logical plan to parent the children, and you start limiting their screen time so that they can stay more adjusted and engaged into your custodial time. And then the alienating parent tells the counselor that you won't let the children have access to the other parent while you have custody. You're possessive, you're isolating the children, and you're being restrictive. You're a restrictive gatekeeper. Where in fact, you're being protective. And so those your actions get assessed in isolation, and there's no context for the therapist to understand how you got to that place. And there's many examples we can give you where we have done these evaluations, and we've seen parents, for example, not not want to sign up for more extracurricular activities because the alienating parent is putting that parent in a position of being a courier, not wanting the alienating parent to have any quality time with the children. They want to keep them in public spaces where there's no intimacy, and so they understand that that's the strategy. And so over time, they say, in order for me to have quality time with my children, I need to be protective of my custodial time. And so they'll start saying no to multiple signups for extracurriculars. And then that gets characterized as, oh, this parent's possessive of the children. They don't want them to be involved in soccer. And so that's an example of them being neglectful and abusive. But that's really decontextualization. The third one is misunderstood. And again, I say this, first, let me read it first. It occurs when the targeted parent's parenting mistakes and overreactions are erroneously seen as signs of parental unfitness or indicative of their characterological flaws, rather than a mistake that average range parents make or targeted parents make under duress. And so we want to talk a little bit about, and we've done this in other presentations, about the amount of stress a rejected or a targeted parent endures. I don't think there's anything more. There may be something more, but I can't imagine anything more painful and grueling than to have the children that once loved and crawled up on your lap and twirled your hair and you guys read books and tucked them into bed in the evening, to have that very same child gut punch you with hateful words and refuse to spend time with you and say they don't love you anymore. That is an incredibly stressful experience. It's like a slow death, emotional and physical, I mean, emotional and spiritual death of your children to you and your attachment to them. So these parents are dealing with that level of rejection and grief, as well as dealing with intense oppositionality, disruptive behavior, sometimes property destruction, and just outright defiance. And so, in the context of that, a lot of times parents who are targeted make mistakes, and they do something that objectively is neglectful or abusive and overreactive. Um, I remember a parent telling me that, they made um, their worst speech in their life one time when their children were attacking them in the car. And then this person told me that they just screamed at the children and proceeded to tell them all the ways that they're wrong and mean and to being disrespectful children. And he just, again, um, kind of went the straw that broke the camel's back and then responded in an abusive way. I'm not saying that that excuses the behavior, but I'm just saying that sometimes those behaviors get misunderstood and they get categorized as that parent is woefully flawed and needs to be, the children need to be protected from that parent because they can't change. All right, so moving into this other important dynamic that I think counselors oftentimes need to pay attention to or at least understand the trends of what we see in parent-child contact problems. And one trend we see, as you can see in this diagram, where there's alienation dynamics on the left and estrangement on the right, is that with estrangement dynamics, oftentimes we see children, and if you're a therapist and you've ever worked in child welfare, or you're a judge or an attorney and have ever worked in child welfare, you often see this pretty clearly, is that children taken away from parents who where there was abject neglect because of substance abuse, or there was sexual abuse that is substantiated. Um, that these children, oftentimes, when you're working with them, they just want to get back with their parents, even though there was this horrific abuse and neglect. They struggle with what we call irrational hope. They truly have ambivalence in that they love their parent. They want the abuse to stop or the neglect to stop, but they don't want the relationship to stop. And so they're struggling with this and wrestling with this. I love my parents. I have this attachment with them, but they're doing bad things, and I want that to stop. And they're quick to jump into wanting to reconcile and quick to forgive. And as clinicians, we often are trying to modulate and manage that and not getting the children to jump into a relationship before the parent has been effectively rehabilitated. In alienation, it's quite different. We're dealing with children who are incredibly polarized and they don't have ambivalence. They tend to are idealizing one parent, which is the preferred alienating parent, and they're denigrating and hating and rejecting another parent and present with no ambiguity around that. And the key emotional factor is that they have irrational fear. And so, even though we know that children have the hope for reconciliation, these children want nothing to do with their parent. Even if you present, when we do these evaluations, one of the questions I like to ask to the children, let's just say I had a magic wand and I could get your parent to be a really good parent and everything to go really well when you're at that house and I could make that happen. What kind of parenting time would you want with that parent? I don't want any parenting time with that parent. Never want to see them again. And again, there's just irrational fear and a polarization and no future orientation for any kind of reconciliation. And that can signal alienation.
Yeah, so it's again, we're going through a couple different aspects of alienation that's important to know, important to incorporate into your clinical intuition and your application in cases that you're working, and also for parents to just have a good base of knowledge. And we're just going through a couple different aspects here, and so Rainey just did a few really important ones. And so I want to talk about unwitting accomplices, and Randy did mention this too, but there's other presentations on family access where we kind of blow these ideas out and have much broader presentations, and we'll highlight a few of those. This is one of them. The idea of unwitting accomplices. I did a presentation a little while ago that you can refer back to. But the idea here is trying to think about other people involved in a family uh, furthering the alienation time and making this worse and not even really realizing it. So we did talk about the fundamental attribution here, how clinicians can lean into an estrangement dynamic and misapply interventions and further the delusion and help a child with abuse when abuse isn't really there. We talked about that, but there are other ways that unwitting accomplices can be involved, and it's important for clinicians to know about this because those things can be brought into the therapist's office as evidence or all these other things. So other mental health professionals, other protective services, in Michigan, we have Child Protective Services, other states have DHS and all these other agencies that go in and that investigate these things. And a lot of times we'll see not even substantiations or findings of abuse, but just the investigations can be brought in as evidence of the targeted parent's unfitness. He's been investigated 6 times. Well, what they don't say is that they've called, DHS 6 times and tried to initiate 6 investigations, and all of a sudden, this agency is being brought in to investigate things that aren't there, and then that's being used as evidence against that targeted parent. And also, school staff, teachers, administrators, legal representatives, friend of the court, which is like an agency we have in Michigan, or other court investigators. Lara is another agency in Michigan for us, but other licensing agencies and all these other things, step parents, step family. These people are all brought in to provide evidence against the targeted parent. And so it's really important to understand that alienating parents do a really good job of setting the table, like walking into the pediatrician's office, and before anything even starts, they just start rattling off all the reasons their kid is stressed or depressed or anxious because of the things they have to go through at the other parent's house. And they just set this table and present this narrative, and they're the first impression, and all of a sudden that gets furthered and furthered across every professional that the family encounters. So it's just really important to understand that these professionals, if they don't have a good understanding of these dynamics, can be brought into that web and be unwitting accomplices. So it's really important to understand that. So just to provide more context in terms of what we're talking about here in these alienation cases, I think it's really important to define what mild, moderate, and severe means, because this is a severe alienation case, or it's a mild, moderate, alienation case. It's really important to understand what that means. So I want to define that for you here. When we say a mild alienation case, the children in that case, the children demonstrate RRDs, resist and refuse dynamics, during transitions and during the beginning of their stay with the rejected parent. These dynamics dissipate to some degree as they spend time with the parent. Randy used that example earlier where, they come into your house, they're a little distant, they're a little cold, but then you play a game with them, and all of a sudden they start warming up. But you can see that happening, and that would just be the beginning or more of a mild stage as those happening during those transitions in the beginning of their time with you. And then in a moderate, the children demonstrate significant RRDs in the presence of the rejected parent. They might refuse to leave their room or exhibit other intense acting out behaviors. Randy mentioned property destruction during this time with the rejected parent. There could be a lot of acting out, a lot of dysfunction, a lot of chaos going on, but they're still coming over. They're still coming over. So that's how we delineate that. And they're still making that transition, but once they're there, it's just all bets are off, and it just becomes this really, really chaotic environment and a lot of acting out behavior. What we assess as severe cases is the complete refusal to participate in parenting time. That's not coming over, um, just not spending any time with a rejected parent, extreme acting out behaviors when forced to be in the presence of the targeted parent, or there can be some of that suicidal ideation or some of that self-harming behavior. We've had some instances where children are checked into to inpatient facilities because of these behaviors becoming so intense that they are refusing to go over, and they'd rather and they end up being in an inpatient facility rather than the targeted parent's house. And so that's what we want to delineate as what's actually a severe case when it rises to that level. So it's important to know that nomenclature. Okay, so it's important to think about developmental stages when it comes to the behavior of these children. So we want to think about from a Piagetian standpoint. I'm speaking to clinicians here, like the pre-operational transitioning into grade operational. So I mentioned in those mild cases where a child is demonstrating some resistance in a transition, where they're in the presence of an alienating parent and they're coming over to the targeted parent. Um, we think about pre-operational functioning, being in that 3 to 7 year range, 3 to 7 year old range, where it's very egocentric. It's going to be very much from the perspective of that child. So they're going to be very in the moment. So they're not going to really be able to hold on to an idea and then bring it with them somewhere else. So they're going to be very much in that moment. They're going to be around the alienating parent. They're going to know that they're attached to that parent. They're going to have to be able to act in a certain way. They know that this other parent is bad. But then all of a sudden, as they get further away from that alienating parent, that idea or that belief that they're supposed to be buying into dissipates because they're not able to bring it with them. The concrete operational stage begins to incorporate the ideas of reversibility and reciprocity that results in like conservation. So all these things that we see as kids just naturally develop with their cognitive functioning, that means they're able to bring it with them. And so they say, I know that I'm attached to this alienating parent. I'm going to leave them. I'm going to not see them for a few days, but I'm still going to hold on to that idea, that delusional process, and bring it with them so that they can go and act out these things. And so it's just really important to understand that we see this playing out a lot of times in the severity of RDs and having um, a progression from younger children um, acting in a certain way, maybe having more of those mild cases, and then progressing as the children get older and having more severe cases where they're in their teenagers. And we actually have seen in cases where siblings that are maybe 5, 9, and 13, I'm just throwing out random numbers there, where the older kids are going to have more of a severe case. And then the younger kids, because of their inability to bring that idea with them, are going to have more of a mild presentation. So it's really important to understand how those developmental stages can play out. All right. So what's really important to understand here is thinking about, again, this is another one of those things where there is another full presentation that you can look up here on Family Access where I discuss this in what's called encapsulated delusional system. And I want to talk about what that means, just so that clinicians and also parents can be aware of how this can be incorporated into the broader context here. So the big thing to think about as the fuel for a lot of this dynamic is going to be attachment and this idea of enmeshment to the alienating parent as the engine for the behavior of this rejection of this parent. And so this child, especially one that's capable of concrete thought, is going to bring this idea and this loyalty contract of I need to be attached to this alienating parent, this parent that I favor, and I'm going to everything that touches this targeted parent, this alienated parent, is going to be poisoned, basically. The tricky part is that baseline functioning in other parts of this child's life can be quite normal. We have cases where a child has a 4.0 GPA and they're a member of the National Honor Society and they're captain of the whatever team and they're just really, really high functioning children. But everything that touches that targeted parent is full of stress and anxiety and depression and all these things that can come into play. And so it's really important to understand that it can be very encapsulated within this system of the family and the alienation dynamic, right? So, and there's a few different ways that encapsulated delusional system can play out. All right. So, what we think about is this idea of confabulation. Okay, and so this would be like a cognitive distortion is thinking about the idea of what confabulation is and how that might play out. Confabulation actually comes from um, uh, dementia research and Alzheimer's research is when those patients have a little bit of shame or guilt around the inability to to remember things or to be able to recall different parts of their life. They will start making up things to try to fill in that gap. And so it's really important to understand that children, when they're carrying around the shame of rejecting a parent, that they will make up things to try to fit the narrative that they're trying to further with their targeted parent and the alienating parent. And so they'll twist things and they'll make things up that try to fit that narrative rather than tell the truth because they have to continue that attachment, that enmeshment with the alienating parent. The other thing to think about is because they're carrying around all the shame and guilt, they're not really able to trust or accept the positive feelings towards their parent. So if they're in the presence of the targeted parent and the parent does something nice for them, they get them a gift, they take them into a fun activity, they understand they're not allowed to feel that. They're not allowed to feel happiness or trust or acceptance. And so they have to twist that. And then they hold on to that shame and guilt. And all of a sudden that becomes, again, part of that encapsulated delusional system with that attachment that it gets twisted and I can't feel those happy things. And again, the relational part of that is just, again, the loyalty attachment, a loyalty contract attachment to the alienating parent is the fuel for a lot of this. So it's really important to understand that it doesn't have to be broader than that. So just a good thing to keep an eye on. Again, you can listen more in the other presentation on how that can play out and how that can be misconstrued when it's brought to the therapist's office as evidence or all these things, and when there could be a much more a couple layers deeper that can be inspected.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Richard Rorschach's 10 parental alienation fallacies, but focusing mostly on the last four. And I think, again, it's a helpful way to look at how clinicians will make decisions, clinical decisions. Sometimes judges will make legal decisions based on what they've experienced other children do, and parameters and maxims that don't apply to alienated children. And that's why Richard Rorschach calls them fallacies. The first one is alienated adolescents' stated preference should dominate custody decisions. What we know is that minor children are minor children until 18 for a reason. They can't vote. We still have authority over them to get them to go to the dentist when they don't want to come home on time, and meet curfews, not get in the car with someone who's driving drunk, all these different things. And so just because an adolescent decides that they don't want to go to another parent's house, that preference needs to be assessed, rather than just giving that child self-agency. And in fact, what we do know is that what we look at when we have alienated children is that we have until 18 to make a difference. So for us, when we have a 17-year-old, we have one more year to get that to work on the alienation, the psychological abuse that's happened in that child, deconstruct the encapsulated delusional system so that they can get back to a grounded place and have a contact with an average range parent or a better parent. And so we want to not give that stated preference too much authority. The second one is children who appear to function well outside the family need no intervention. And as Zach covered earlier, if you have a kid with an encapsulated delusional system, that's a clinical issue. They're not thinking straight. They're not grounded in reality. They have a chance of losing social capital with a really good parent. So you can't just because they're functioning outside, um, doing really well doesn't mean that you make that kid, again, see that they don't need some kind of intervention. The third one is severely alienated children are best treated with traditional therapy techniques, which while living primarily with their favorite parent. And again, Zach covered the mild, moderate, and severe. If you have a severe case and that child is not making any connection out of a loyalty contract with the alienating parent, doing outpatient therapy at an hour a week is probably not going to, most likely, it's not going to have an impact if the prognosis is incredibly poor because they remain attached and in contact with the alienating parent, and that bond remains a dysfunctional enmeshed bond remains in place until that's deconstructed. The child's not freed up to begin making reparative attachments to the targeted parent. And then finally, separated children from an alienating parent is traumatic. Again, we think that fallacy is based on the sense that we assume a close relationship is a healthy relationship. And we assume that a child's preference that I want to be with his parent is going to be traumatic if you separate them. And what we find out in severe cases oftentimes is when children are set free from having to pay attention to the alienating parents' feelings and needs and their narrative, they actually can settle in quite quickly at reconnecting. And they're looking for mental health professionals and and legal professionals to take charge of their lives and set them free. And that can be an important thing to remember that it's not traumatic, it's a step toward health.
I would just think just like for clinicians to think about this in another way for that last one, thinking about
Sure.
you did a really good thing of saying that a close relationship is a good relationship. I would think about like Munchausen by proxy is like, would you think about like separating a child from a parent that's a mesh with them in that way and then having them present sick in a doctor's office? No, it'd actually be really helpful to separate from that dynamic and that enmeshment, and
Right.
it wouldn't be traumatic. You might feel traumatic in the room when you're telling the child that they can't be with that enmeshed parent anymore, but at the
Right.
same time, that's freeing them of this
Right.
emotional abuse. There's a
Right.
one way to think about it.
Yeah. And we would do that with school phobia, or the child has a fear of going to school. You don't look at, the screaming and yelling going to school to average range teachers and a decent principal as being a traumatic thing. Yeah, they're gonna scream and yell getting out of the car, but you don't say, "Oh, they're being traumatized, and so we need to keep them with the parent, and they need to go back home." You're never gonna treat the school phobia that way. So I mentioned social capital, and it's important to look at that is that I think that social capital refers to the benefit a child derives from the social and psychological resources available to him or her in a particular environment, community, or family, especially in the most significant relationships for the child. Was derived from parents, extended family, siblings, peers, teachers, coaches, etc. And it is accrued in the form of positive models, trust, values, resources, commitment, instruction, discipline, and friendship. So again, it's just incredibly important. We just assume it's like the water swim in, or the metaphor of a fish. That social capital is such a huge thing, and so we have to be able to look at the consequences of eradicating a child's access to a parent and their whole extended family, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and what that can do to a child's well-being as they move into an adult life. I want to spend three so a moment to introduce you to three hybrid cases that we often will see in again we saw this spectrum, and we said estrangement on one side and alienation on the other. So the first hybrid case is when both estrangement and alienation dynamics are contributing to the resist and refuse dynamics. And that is, and again, it's not necessarily 50-50. It can be 60-40, 70-30, but you do have both operative, and then you have one parent who obviously is an expert on what the other parent is doing, and they don't have accountability for what they are doing. And the second hybrid case is that the case begins as an estrangement case and then evolves into a primary alienation case. And that is, again, you see that if the case has a lot of history to it, where you have a parent perhaps that maybe got arrested for domestic violence, and they attended and they followed their probation requirements. They went into a batterer intervention treatment program. They made progress. They've been assessed and evaluated by a forensic evaluator to determine that that parent has been sufficiently rehabilitated, and followed through with all the recommendations by the court. And then all of a sudden, the other parent is not willing to reintroduce the child back into that rehabilitated parent's life. And what is causing the resist refuse dynamic is more the irrational fear component rather than the oftentimes what we said with abused children, they have hope and they want their parents to rehabilitate, and now they're being blocked from reconnecting with that parent. And the third one is the case begins as an alienation case, and the stress reaction mistakes from the rejected parent exacerbates the resist and refuse dynamic. So then you got this beleaguered, exasperated, um, targeted parent that's just not getting the proper help and counseling resources, or maybe just has a predisposition to not deal with stress. And so they end up having this more abusive and neglectful reactivity to the alienation dynamics. And now that's also a hybrid case. I want to introduce you to just this notion of counterproductive protective parenting. I know that's a mouthful, but it is a maladaptive process by which a parent limits the contact between children and a historically unfit parent. This level of protection or methods of protection are not congruent, excuse me, with the current realities of the case, and mild levels of obstructive gatekeeping are occurring. So I kind of alluded to this in the hybrid case, but I think this is not, again, the parent is not operating from this mode of wanting to like erase or alienate a parent. They just have unresolved trauma, unresolved fears, unresolved anxieties, and they're just not able to move along the continuum or the graduated parenting time plan. And so their obstructive parenting is counterproductive. And oftentimes these parents do respond with intervention and treatment when they're made aware of what's going on, and they can make proper changes where an alienating parent are not as responsive to those interventions.
Yeah, I would think about like the idea of like someone having a substance use problem or a parent having an issue with alcohol abuse. If we removed all parenting time for every single individual on this planet that had a drinking problem, we'd have a lot of single parents. And so like there's a scenario where there's a lot of trauma and pain from the parent that didn't have the drinking problem, and they have a lack of trust and all that, and they have a stunted healing process for understandable reasons at times, where they don't feel like they can trust that parent that had that problem, and so they have a lack of progression in that process, as he said. So it's just important to look at the broad history of it.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Good point. So the next concept we want to introduce you to, and again, I did a family access presentation on the 5 common mistakes of a targeted parent makes, and so you can refer to that for a more detailed explanation of these 5 common mistakes. But again, want you to be aware of them. The first one is that a mistake that a targeted parent will make, that they misunderstand their children and personalize the rejection. Again, this is a parent who finds himself in an alienation dynamic, has not done any reading about it, and just assumes the child is being rebellious and losing the gains that they made in the parenting, and so they want to they don't have compassion or empathy for the child, and they just see it as just acting out behavior. The second mistake is they believe that, as a result of that belief, is that increased punishment and discipline will put an end to the misunderstood attitudes and behaviors from the children. So again, from that lack of understanding, they see it as an acting out child, and they start disciplining the child and think that the resist and refuse dynamics will go away by just merely disciplining, and that's not going to happen. Thirdly, is they enlist or allow extended family and friends to lecture and advise the children. So they grow exasperated that I'm not having an impact. So maybe Uncle Henry can talk some sense into this kid, or Grandma can. So they enlist the extended family to then begin lecturing, and again, that causes more problems for the child, feeling like this new tribe of people are ganging up on them, and they want to resist more. The fourth one is that they start retaliating toward the alienating parent. It's like, if you want to do this to me, then I'll do this to you. And so it becomes this kind of tit for tat, and counter motions and things like that. And that's obviously not going to be effective. And the final one is they present, unfortunately, as angry, argumentative, and obstinate to the professionals. And so, again, these professionals who sometimes are looking through an estrangement lens, you walk into the counseling's office and you play right into the narrative and right into the hands, because you come in there both guns a slinging, and you're just like angry, and you're appear very obstinate and agitated, and that does is another mistake that we see rejected parents make. So coaching and counseling can be very helpful for you as a targeted parent if you're not getting that kind of support. So let's take a look at again, Kelly and Johnson have this nice diagram here. It's called the child's response to background factors and intervening variables. In the middle, you got the child's response, which is the resist and refuse dynamics. And then you see in that diagram all the different factors and contributors to that child's response. You have older siblings influencing a child. You have like maybe a really religious family who has this you know, belief that marriages should always stay together, and they go to a religious parochial school, and they're the only family who's going through a divorce. And so whoever did the divorce is now the bad person. And so they get seen as a targeted parent because they broke the family up. So there's all these different dynamics and variables that I think as clinicians we need to be sensitive to, and see that when you have the child in your office, you have the child's response, but you have so many other assessment variables. And again, as evaluators, we look into all of these categories.
And the important thing to think about though is in severe cases where parental alienation is leading to really severe and intense resist and refuse dynamics. There's a lot of belief here that the parental alienation is going to be that primary fuel, that primary engine for all these dynamics. So while you saw in that previous diagram that Randy was mentioning, there's a lot of different mediating variables and a lot of different things that come in, but it's important to understand that the parental alienation, the enmeshment, and the loyalty contract with that targeted parent is going to be that main engine. If that's taken away, so basically all of the problems can then dissolve. And so in these intense, really, really clean cut alienation cases, maybe not so much those hybrid ones that we were talking about earlier, but when there's a true alienation dynamic where there's a sense of premeditation or a lack of emotional functioning on the part of the alienating parent, where there can be some personality disorder characteristics and all these things that can come into play. That alienation dynamic is going to be that main source of this dysfunction. So it's really important to highlight that and not try to over index the mediating variables and try to think about the primary cause here. And so it's just to speak also about the difference between clinical and forensic therapy. So clinical therapy is going to be just a general outpatient therapy, one-on-one, talking about coping skills, anxiety, depression, all the things which are obviously very important, very, very, very needed in this society here. But we also want to talk about the difference between that and forensic therapy, where clinical therapy is going to be very client centric. There's going to be, like I said, an over indexing, or not over indexing, but just a propensity to be able to speak and meet that child where they are, be able to help them have agency, help them be able to communicate. But when it comes to forensic therapy, we want to think about within the context of being able to work within a high conflict divorce, or just a divorce environment where there's court officials and there's decisions about therapy or custody being figured out. In that world, you have to be much more objective and be able to stay in the center of all this and be able to take information from a bunch of different sources, have multiple hypotheses going at once, trying to figure out where you might fit in. And again, in that process, you want to stay in your lane of I'm just here for this reason, whatever it may be. And we'll talk about some of those different reasons here in a little bit. Is you want to be able to think about not being so much in that moment, being able to take a step back and look at the broader picture here. And what I think about, what we think about here is the parallels of the medical model. Of some situations can be addressed by a primary care physician. If you go in and you've got some issues with some cholesterol or something, you can just talk about some medication regimens and all that, and it can be taken care of in that office. But there's some situations where they need to be referred to a specialist. Is there a PCP isn't going to help you with a triple bypass heart surgery? That would probably not end very well. And so you want to be able to refer out to a specialist that able to be well equipped to handle these type of situations. So if you're a parent or if you're a clinician that you see that there's a situation where you're not well equipped to handle this family, you want to be able to refer out or get the proper training to be able to help a child properly. And if you're a parent and you understand that there is a clinician that might not be well equipped or well versed in these things that we're talking about here today, is being able to respectfully and cogently advocate for yourself to be able to be placed with a clinician that would be better suited to help you. Um, so what we want to do is talk about some best, and we want to move along here is some best practices and some common clinical scenarios to be able to outline for parents and clinicians here um, what best to do. So the first one is best practices for parents. And so Randy mentioned some of those top, the 5 common mistakes that parents make. It's important to understand those in the context of this. But thinking about when you're walking into that clinician's office and you're introducing yourself or trying to put forth your narrative in terms of your belief of what's going on, you want to understand the broader context of empathy for a clinician that might not be well versed in this. And quite possibly, especially if you're watching this video on this channel, it's very possible that you know more about alienation than the therapist in the room. Is you've watched a lot of videos, done a lot of research, you're very well immersed in this world because you know this is what's going on with your family. You're going to be very passionate and have a lot of background knowledge and maybe have a lot of clinical language that this clinician maybe not be well versed in. And if you're throwing that at them right away, that could put someone on the defensive. So it's very possible that you have to be able to talk with empathy and be able to connect and try to understand where the other person is coming from. Furthermore, you got to develop as a parent healthy coping skills. Randy mentioned, and I mentioned as well, is like this is one of the more stressful things that a parent could ever experience is the slow spiritual and emotional death of their child right in front of them. So you have to be able to understand your stress levels and where you're carrying it and where you have healthy outlets. Do you like listening to the first Led Zeppelin album and just kind of unplugging, or do you like going for a run or whatever? Like whatever it may be, having a healthy coping skill to be able to to be able to unplug and be able to release some of that tension so it's not being taken out on the therapist or the child who doesn't deserve it. And then also being able to focus on developing your parenting skills is like, what does it look like to communicate? What does it like to set healthy boundaries with your child? How do you properly stay consistent with the way that you interact and set expectations for that child? And being able to develop those independently for yourself can really help set yourself up for success in the long run. Okay, this I want to speak to clinicians here is thinking about the broader context we've been talking about here and the way that an alienating parent can come in and try to set a narrative and try to set the table. A lot of times, if you're just seeing a child and just seeing the alienating parent and the targeted parent is involved, there can be a lot of setting a table of reporting of all this abuse and all this stuff and talk about all the anxiety and the depression and all this the fear this child is experiencing towards this targeted parent. You might be asked to write a letter like, can you tell the judge how scared that my child is of this other parent? Like, can you I want the judge to be able to understand what you see, is being able to ask yourself, like, why am I writing that letter? What am I basing that off of? Is that a good idea? Is that within my professional role to be able to make an assessment or make recommendations towards what this child needs in their custodial environment? Who's requesting it? Do I have the ability to speak to the other parents and be able to corroborate some of these things or be able to have an impression of the other person before I start making these decisions? Or there's all these questions that you want to ask, and most likely it's going to be a very limited role that you have, especially if you're in a treatment role, is you're not really going to be able to make evaluative decisions or recommendations to the judge. And if you do, when you're not assigned an evaluative role, that can really get you into trouble. And so it's really important to understand the dynamics that we've outlined here when you're requested to do something such as this. And so everyone knows that, letters to judges in those roles are things that we're all trained on as clinicians, but it can even have an extra layer of complexity when the stakes are risen and things are being said in the room where these intense feelings are being put forth in the room when you feel like you have this responsibility to keep people safe when you don't have a full understanding that this is actually an alienation dynamic playing in, and all of a sudden you're furthering a dynamic that is being harmful to the child and not freeing them from an enmeshment and from an alienation dynamic. So just important to take a second and ask these questions before you write something.
So just to go back briefly where Zach was talking about developing parenting skills, I think that we oftentimes, if you have a child who has a ADHD, if you have a child on the spectrum, or you have a child who has some handicaps or whatever, there's oftentimes this permission to say you need specialized parenting skills because this is a unique situation and parenting is hard enough, but to parent a child such as this is going to require these really sophisticated strategies. And it's like, I'm telling you, to parent what I've heard over the decades of working with parents who are working with these, alienated children, it takes so many skills and so much sophistication, so much assessment about, do I step this way now or do I step that way later? It's really, really delicate, and there's so many landmines in terms of how you um, parent with these children. So I really, really recommend that you continue to look at these resources, such as these videos on family access, and then continue your reading and then seeking out counseling or coaching so you can be the best parent in this difficult situation. So looking at interventions, I want to just very briefly, in the interest of time, we talked about mild, moderate, and severe cases, and so along with that assessment is a calibration of what types of interventions are going to be the most appropriate and the most helpful and offer the best prognosis. You don't want to be doing something too much and you don't want to be doing it too little. It's kind of like in medicine, it's like you get some medications and you want to make sure the frequency that you're taking the medication and the dose is exactly calibrated for it to be therapeutic. And that's same with alienation, depending on if it's mild, moderate, and severe, there's certain interventions that are going to be helpful and some that are not. In mild cases, a lot of times psychoeducation, a lot of educating of parents, of children of what's going on, um, educating about social capital, what the court expects when it comes to custody and parenting time. Sometimes parents are just naively think, oh, the children can decide. No, this is a court order. This is a judge's order. You need to comply or else there's going to be problems. And that psychoeducation can be helpful. When you move into more moderate cases, then you can start getting services, interventions such as a parenting coordinator can help with making co-parenting decisions, and sometimes a guardian ad litem can be involved. And again, just helping parents in having different kinds of interventions, such as co-parenting counseling. And then when you move into, like reunification counseling can be helpful in more mild cases, where a parent children are still going over to the non-custodial parent's house or the targeted parent's house. Sometimes that psychoeducation, helping with transitions, helping both parents with each understanding their roles. That type of outpatient counseling can be helpful.
And it's really
Um,
important to understand that in these interventions, like especially with reunification therapy, really is helpful to have diagnostic clarity to be effective. And a lot of times reunification can be done for estrangement and alienation. And so a lot of times this can be thrown out there as like a, a band-aid. Oh, just get them some reunification therapy. But if both parents are coming in without any clarity as terms of why this child is resisting, all of a sudden that becomes a very different type of intervention. And so, like, if one parent is saying that this child is abused and they're scared, and the other parent is this person is being alienated and they're just rejecting me for no reason, all of a sudden you're caught in the middle trying to do two interventions at once, and that's just never really going to work. And so, it's really important, not always required, but it's really helpful for the prognosis of the treatment to have some sort of judicial finding, judicial oversight, some evaluation, some sort of declaration of why this reunification is needed. Because then all of a sudden, as a clinician, you can go in armed with this thing and like, no, this is what we're working on. This is why we're here, and it allows you to set goals much clearer. Obviously, we talk about goals in therapy as being so important to keep everyone on the same page and keep everyone on track. And so it's really important to get a sense of what's possible there before taking on a reunification case. And if you're a parent trying to have a little more of that oversight and a little more of a judicial finding going in, because that's going to really help the reunification therapy be more effective and just have your whole life be more efficient in this regard. Um, so just thinking about some more severe cases, parent coordination and GAL can be there. There are multi-day intensive group experiential treatment programs like Overcoming Barriers, Family Bridges, Transition Families, Turning Points. You can do your research on those. Those can be where, in these intense cases where there's an immersion with the targeted parent to try to help rectify some of this. And so in education and treatment patients treatment is not likely to be helpful, because it's just not going to be sufficient for these cases of just coming in for 1 hour a week when the alienation dynamics continuing for the rest of the week with this targeted parent or with the alienating parent. I'm sorry. So just another thing on the menu for you. And then in other severe cases, there's custody change from the alienating parent. We talked about that earlier. It's not traumatic to remove a child. There can be no contact, no contact orders for 90 days. 30 days, 45 days. And then these also can require evaluations, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit. And just really important to think about all the different things that are on the menu there. And you can read those here in the slide. And then finally, the really sad reality sometimes is if all options are exhausted, is sometimes the alienated parent, the targeted parent, has to let go. And that's really sad, especially if a child is after 18, if they age out and they don't really have any more recourse with the courts. It's just a really sad reality I think we have to acknowledge. But just knowing that evaluations, immersion programs, other intense therapies, those things can be assessed as possibilities.
If you need an evaluation, I want to introduce you to the kind of the components of an evaluation. I do think there's a place, again, if you're considering reunification counseling and there hasn't been a finding yet, and you're looking at a, some moderate case of alienation, you want to have an evaluation to get that finding. And what we do is do what they call a resist or refuse dynamics evaluation and parent-child contact problems, and that's specifically the purpose. It's our job as forensic psychologists to evaluate what is causing the resist and refuse dynamics. And so we do that by assessing both domestic partners. We meet with children. We do joint interviews with the parents and the children. We do a lot of collateral reviews with documents and do interviews with professionals, and then conduct psychological testing to get impressions clinically of each parent and the children, and then write a full report with findings and recommendations. And again, there's hopefully professionals in your area. You could talk to your attorney and seek out a specific forensic family evaluation to get at the root cause, and then treatment can be developed accordingly. So, looking at the forensic psychological services ecosystem, you probably never planned on getting involved in this ecosystem, and you prefer not to be in it, but you probably are in it. And so, I think it's important to know what it consists of. You know, you got the family court is involved. You've got potentially evaluators. You got professional counselors, and you've got specialized psychological services such as parenting coordination, parent-child reunification, and then what can cross state lines oftentimes because licensure puts people as psychologists working with families clinically sometimes to put them in a place where they can only practice in their state. But with consultation, thankfully, we've been able to coach and involve ourselves in as non-testifying consultants with attorneys behind the scene and things like that to help families, and that's sometimes a valuable service. It is difficult enough to effectively address parental alienation dynamics, but it is impossible when it isn't properly identified and contraindicated interventions are on board. So we must strive to do better, and we think that there is help, and hopefully this presentation has provided some of that. And just looking at some of the resources for you to be aware of as you begin to kind of figure this out where you're at in your case is that there's the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, and you can see their website there on the on that slide. And there might be um, professionals in your area who are members of AFCC, and they can be a really good resource for you. Also, the Parental Alienation Study Group, and you can see their website as well on this slide. And they are specialists who understand parental alienation, and you can get access to their website and see what professional might be in your area or different people you might want to seek out. And then, of course, where Zach and I work is at the Fountain Hill Center, and we have court-related collaborative services, a variety of clinicians providing these specialized services, evaluations, and consultations and coaching, and that's available. And you can check out our website as well. There, you can see our website on the screen there.
Yeah, so I just, as we wrap up here, I just want to say thank you to everyone for tuning into this presentation. I know it's a lot of information. We try to give you a good base of knowledge, and I just want to empathize with clinicians and parents coming into this world can be really stressful, especially for parents, obviously. For the reasons that we mentioned earlier, this is a really challenging and painful time, and it's can feel like you're very lost and you don't really have a lot of recourse or a lot of resources here. And so I hope that this presentation can help alleviate a little bit of that for you, and just and hope that if we can be of service, that you could please reach out to us and we can offer coaching and consultation for targeted parents and maybe help with some consultation for lawyers and other legal professionals. And if clinicians want to reach out to us and figure out the best way to put their best foot forward and get into this work, as challenging as it is, it's also very, very rewarding when you can help families navigate this. So our emails are on the screen here. So if you need anything, please feel free to reach out to us and we can hopefully be of service. And so again, finally, I just want to say thank you, and we wish all the listeners and watchers here the nothing but the best, and I hope that we can again be of service to you. And again, thank you to Elaine and Family Access for having us, and hope that you have a great rest of your day.